Welcome back to the Paranormal State, Washington, and UFO UAP. With Makāula Nakae, a lifelong experiencer and ET contactee since 1990. Today's episode, 1943 to 1945. Project Riese, giant Nazi Germany in the wild and wacky world of World War II ufology. You can always count on the Nazi UFO conspiracy to show up right on schedule. It's right up there with glowing Foo Fighters playing tag with Allied bombers and mysterious UAPs treating atomic bomb tests like a roadside tourist attraction. According to the internet historians, Hitler didn't actually lose the war. He just packed his bags, hopped into a secret anti-gravity saucer, took a scenic retirement cruise down to South America, set up a luxury lair under the Antarctic ice, and eventually bounced right off to colonize Mars. Really? Mars? Look, it's fascinating, fundamentally creative, and fantastically wild. But let's look at reality for a hot second. This is the exact same regime whose tanks routinely turned into overpriced paperweights during the Russian winter, and whose supply chain ran on stolen horses. Entrusting them to build a warp-capable flying saucer is basically like letting a very confused raccoon operate a nuclear submarine, using a half-eaten sandwich and a prayer. Did they mess around with secret weapons? Sure. Did they fail spectacularly? You bet. Unless we fire a Project Looking Glass to time travel and check the South Pole ourselves, we might just have to admit that human beings will always prefer a blockbuster sci-fi epic over a history book about running out of fuel. The Third Reich's ultimate subterranean megaproject. Initiated in 1943 and spanning through the final desperate collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945, Project Riese, German for giant, represents the largest, most ambitious, and most mysterious secret engineering undertaking of World War II. Hidden deep within the rugged Owl Mountains and beneath the historic Ksiaz castle in Lower Silesia, then German territory, now southwestern Poland, this colossal venture left behind a haunting network of unfinished tunnels, fortified halls, and industrial ruins that continue to baffle historians and fuel dark alternative history legends. A comprehensive look at the history, scale, and mechanics of Project Riese exposes the stark reality behind the mythos. The birth of Project Riese in late 1943 was not a whimsical exercise in military engineering. It was a desperate, high-stakes response to an existential collapse facing the Third Reich. As the Allied air offensive shifted from sporadic night raids to a relentless, round-the-clock industrial annihilation campaign, Germany's surface-level infrastructure became entirely untenable. Project Riese, giant, was not the brainchild of a single individual or a lone scientist, but rather a massive, collective undertaking conceived and directed by the highest echelons of the Nazi regime as the war turned against them. Whose idea was it? The masterminds. The overarching concept came directly from the top leadership of the Third Reich, heavily driven by Adolf Hitler. As Allied bombing campaigns devastated German cities and surface-level infrastructure, Hitler mandated the creation of bomb-proof, secure underground redoubts to house his headquarters, the high command, and vital state functions. Adolf Hitler's obsession with carving massive, bomb-proof subterranean complexes, like Project Riese, was not born overnight. It was the logical culmination of his military ideology, his deep-seated psychological need for absolute control, and the brutal physical reality of a losing war. A deep dive into why he developed this idea and how it evolved reveals the mindset driving the Third Reich's ultimate underground megaproject. 1. Why did Hitler conceive the idea? From the very beginning of his political and military career, Hitler viewed modern warfare through a lens of concrete, steel, and unyielding will. However, by 1943, that worldview was systematically shattered by Allied air power. As the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces achieved total air dominance, turning German cities and factories into smoking ruins, Hitler realized that surface-level architecture was inherently fragile. To maintain command, the regime could no longer rely on conventional surface buildings. The existential threat of round-the-clock bombing campaigns forced the dictator to seek absolute immunity deep beneath the Earth's crust. Hitler's strategic thinking was heavily influenced by a bunker mentality. Even before Project Riese, he operated out of heavily fortified subterranean field headquarters. These bunkers were physical manifestations of his belief that a leader must be insulated from the chaotic, messy reality of the outside world. As the Red Army advanced from the east and Western Allies closed in from the west, Hitler envisioned vast underground networks as impregnable fortresses, places where the elite leadership could weather storms, plan counteroffensives, and rule from an untouchable subterranean throne. How did the idea manifest and evolve? The conceptual transition from a standard military bunker to a massive regional megaproject, like Project Riese, happened incrementally. Step 1. Tactical bunkers. Early in the war, frontline field headquarters were relatively modest reinforced concrete bunkers buried under a few meters of earth. Step 2. The strategic shift. As the air war escalated in 1943, tactical bunkers proved insufficient against heavy blockbusters. Hitler and his planners shifted from bunkers to mountain complexes, realizing they needed entire geological formations, like the hard gneiss of the Owl Mountains, to absorb the kinetic energy of the heaviest Allied ordnance. Hitler did not draft the blueprints or calculate the structural load-bearing limits of gneiss rock. Instead, his how relied on total totalitarian delegation. Hitler issued the strategic order demanding bomb-proof decentralization and secure command redoubts in safe eastern territories. Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments and the organization taught translated Hitler's grand, paranoid vision into logistical reality. They surveyed Lower Silesia, mobilized millions of tons of concrete, and initiated the forced labor apparatus necessary to turn the dictator's subterranean obsession into a physical labyrinth. Hitler's idea of an impregnable subterranean sanctuary ultimately became a structural trap. Project Riese was never finished, and instead of serving as a triumphant redoubt for the thousand-year Reich, it became a cold, damp network of unfinished stone tombs built on slave labor. Swallowed by the earth and left behind as a haunting monument to totalitarian delusion. Albert Speer, as the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, Speer spearheaded the administrative initiative in late 1943 to decentralize German manufacturing and move critical command and industrial nodes underground into safer eastern territories, like Lower Silesia. The Owl Mountains. Who was the scientist? The engineers and builders. Project Riese was not a scientific laboratory or a research project led by a specific physicist or weapons scientist, which is why legends like the Nazi bell lack any historical paper trail. Instead, it was an engineering and civil construction project. The operational execution was handed over to the organization taught, the Nazi regime's centralized military engineering and forced labor corporation. Regional management was assigned to specialized front companies, such as the Silesian Industrial Company, which oversaw the deployment of millions of tons of steel and concrete. The physical labor was driven entirely by brutality rather than scientific innovation. The engineering force relied on thousands of enslaved prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates from the Gross-Rosen network, who were worked to death drilling through the hard gneiss rock. A deep dive into the strategic catalysts behind the project reveals how air war pressure, shifting bureaucratic power, and the obsession with advanced weaponry forced the Nazi regime underground. By late 1943, the combined air forces of the Royal Air Force, RAF, and the United States Army Air Forces, USAF, had achieved devastating air superiority over Western and Central Europe. Core industrial hearts such as the Ruhr Valley, synthetic fuel plants, steel mills, and electrical grids were systematically battered. Surface-level manufacturing hubs could no longer guarantee continuous output. To keep the war machine functioning, the Reich had to abandon surface architecture. The logistical leadership realized that if critical research, command, and production facilities remained exposed to the skies, total military collapse was merely a matter of time. This realization triggered a massive, desperate pivot towards subterranean relocation. Faced with this crisis, Reich Minister of Armaments Albert Speer, the technocratic architect of Germany's war economy, joined forces with top officials of the organization taught, the centralized military engineering and forced labor corporation, responsible for constructing the Atlantic Wall and Autobahn. The Owl Mountains in Lower Silesia, deep within pre-war German territory, far removed from the Western Front and sheltered by natural terrain, were selected as the primary zone for relocation. The overarching plan was to disperse critical state functions away from Berlin and vulnerable Western cities, creating heavily fortified, self-sustaining subterranean nodes in the east that could withstand heavy bomb loads and continue operating, even if the surface above was entirely overrun. The blueprint for Project Riese was massive in scope, divided into two distinct, high-priority objectives. A primary goal was constructing an extensive, ultra-secure underground headquarters complex for Adolf Hitler, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, and the elite leadership of the Nazi state. This included secure sleeping quarters, conference halls, communication nodes, and defensive fortifications designed to serve as the ultimate redoubt if Berlin fell. The second purpose was carving out massive subterranean factories to house the development and manufacturing of the Reich's secret wonder weapons. As programs like the V-2 ballistic missile, jet aircraft, Me-262, radar systems, and cutting-edge electrical engineering required absolute secrecy and protection from sabotage or bombing. These underground complexes were envisioned as invincible hives for high-tech military innovation. Ironically, despite the immense expenditure of capital, raw materials, and hundreds of thousands of human lives, Project Riese failed in its primary strategic mission. None of the underground complexes were completed by the time the Red Army swept through Lower Silesia in early 1945. Instead of serving as a functional sanctuary for the Third Reich's High Command or advanced weapons labs, Project Riese became a vast, unfinished labyrinth of cold stone, leaving behind a haunting architectural ghost that would later fuel decades of alternative history and technological mythmaking. While the strategic vision behind Project Riese was grand, aiming to carve an impregnable subterranean empire out of the mountains of Lower Silesia, the execution of the project quickly descended into an industrial and humanitarian nightmare. The monumental scale of the undertaking clashed violently with the harsh geological reality of the Alm Mountains and the ruthless human cost imposed by the Nazi SS. A deep dive into the engineering hurdles and the tragic human toll reveals the true mechanics behind the construction of the Third Reich's ultimate underground labyrinth. Unlike many other clandestine wartime underground installations in Europe, such as those carved into soft, easily excavated chalk or sandstone, the Owl Mountains presented a severe geological obstacle. The mountain core is composed of gneiss and extremely hard, highly resilient metamorphic rock. This dense geological composition meant that traditional picks, shovels, and simple tunneling methods were utterly useless. Progress required a relentless, deafening cycle of pneumatic drilling, packing boreholes with industrial explosives, and detonating charges to fracture the rock face. Following each blast, exhausted workers had to clear tons of jagged rubble, haul it out of the tunnels, and immediately begin the precarious task of shoring up the newly carved chambers. To prevent catastrophic cave-ins, massive volumes of concrete and steel were required to line the ceilings and walls. Despite millions of tons of building materials being funneled into the region by the organization Taut, the sheer speed of the Allied advance and logistical bottlenecks meant that none of the 7 complexes were ever fully completed. Estimates indicate that only a small percentage of the vast network ever received its final concrete lining, leaving miles of rough, raw rock tunnels exposed to the damp mountain air. Project Riese was subdivided into 7 distinct, geographically separated underground zones, each designed for specialized command, administrative, or industrial functions. A massive, multi-level tunneling operation bored deep beneath the foundations of a historic aristocratic castle, intended to serve as a private residence and command suite for Adolf Hitler. The largest of all the complexes, featuring vast, soaring halls and multi-layered corridors that demonstrated the sheer scale of the engineering ambition. Highly fortified and featuring above-ground concrete surface structures, the Death Gate and industrial utility buildings, believed to be designated for high command administration or secret communications. Smaller, interconnected complexes designed to house security personnel, auxiliary generators, or specialized workshops. The engineering impossibility of carving miles of solid gneiss under wartime constraints was solved by the Nazi regime through brutal industrial-scale human exploitation. The labor force behind Project Riese was entirely composed of forced laborers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates. These workers were funneled directly from a sprawling network of subcamps established by the SS specifically for Project Riese, operating under the administrative umbrella of the nearby Gross-Rosen concentration camp. Workers were subjected to starvation rations, inadequate clothing, brutal beatings by SS guards, and relentless 12 to 16-hour shifts inside freezing, waterlogged tunnels. The damp environment caused chronic respiratory illnesses, frostbite, and structural cave-ins that crushed workers instantly. While post-war popular culture often fixates on the romanticized sci-fi mythology of secret Nazi wonder weapons and hidden underground technology, the true, dark core of Project Riese is defined by industrial-scale human suffering. The human catastrophe reached its absolute nadir during the bitter winter of 1943 to 1944, transforming the picturesque Owl Mountains into a silent zone of mass death. A deep dive into the mechanics of the camp conditions, the mechanics of the epidemic, and the brutal SS triage policy reveals the grim reality behind the tunnels. The labor force assigned to carve out the multi-layered underground complexes of Project Riese was housed in a sprawling network of subcamps subordinate to the main Gross-Rosen concentration camp. Prisoners lived in primitive, overcrowded wooden barracks that offered virtually no insulation against the freezing lower Silesian winter temperatures. There was a catastrophic shortage of clean water, proper drainage, and basic sanitation facilities. Due to the severe lack of soap, hot water, and changes of clothing, the barracks and prisoners' garments quickly became heavily infested with body lice. These parasites served as the primary biological vectors for Rickettsia prausicii, the bacterium responsible for epidemic louse-borne typhus. As winter set in, the combination of sub-zero temperatures, chronic starvation rations, often consisting of little more than watery turnip soup and minimal bread, and backbreaking physical labor in the damp, unlined tunnels of complexes like Wladars and Asoka completely destroyed the prisoners' immune systems. Once typhus entered the camp network, it swept through the overcrowded bunks with terrifying speed. High fevers, delirium, severe body aches, and characteristic rashes incapacitated thousands of workers within days. A prisoner weakened by starvation had zero biological reserves to fight off typhus. Coupled with chronic exhaustion from 16-hour shifts drilling hard gneiss rock, the disease decimated the workforce, drastically cutting excavation output, just as Berlin was demanding faster progress. In the eyes of the SS overseers and camp administrators, sick, dying, or exhausted prisoners possessed zero economic or strategic value. When the typhus epidemic threatened to halt construction entirely, the regime implemented a ruthless system of medical triage and murder. Inmates who were too weak to stand, display active symptoms of typhus, or recover quickly enough to return to the tunnels were formally selected for elimination. They were executed via lethal injections, exposure, deliberate neglect in makeshift sick barracks, or transferred back to the main Gross-Rosen camp, specifically to be murdered in the gas chambers. The sheer volume of dead bodies overwhelmed local disposal methods. Thousands of victims who succumbed to disease, starvation, or execution were hastily dumped into mass graves scattered across the mountain ravines or burned in makeshift pyres and camp crematoria. The typhus epidemic of 1943 to 1944 and the ruthless management of the Gross-Rosen subcamps turned the entire Owl Mountains range into a vast, silent, and largely unmarked graveyard. When researchers, historians, and explorers walk through the damp, echoing corridors of Project Riese today, the raw stone walls are shadowed by a much darker reality than any alternative history legend. A monument built entirely on the systematic destruction of human lives. The physical remnants of Project Riese, the jagged, unlined stone walls, the rusted reinforcement bars, and the towering concrete pillars, stand today as a haunting monument to totalitarian hubris. Beneath the layers of modern alternative history mythology and fringe legends, the true story of Project Riese remains firmly anchored in a dark, tragic reality. A monument built entirely on the broken backs of slave labor, swallowed by the hard mountain stone before it could ever fulfill its master's ambitions. The true historical tragedy of Project Riese is hilariously and frustratingly compounded by a frustrating administrative vacuum, because the Nazi regime systematically destroyed, misplaced, or completely forgot to compile any comprehensive paperwork, as the Red Army launched its Vistula-Oder offensive in early 1945. There is no definitive wartime architectural blueprint or master directive outlining the precise final purpose of every single complex. This lack of a clean paper trail created a historical vacuum. one that mainstream science and alternative history mythmakers have spent decades fiercely competing to fill like two rival toddlers, fighting over a very confusing puzzle piece. A deep dive into this dichotomy reveals how a real wartime catastrophe mutated into modern legend. Mainstream historians, architectural investigators, and forensic engineers view Project Riese through a strictly empirical lens, anchoring their conclusions in surviving fragments of organization-taught records. Albert Speer's ministry memos and post-war interrogations of surviving Nazi officials who probably just wanted to go home. When separating wartime reality from post-war science fiction regarding Project Riese, mainstream historians, architectural investigators, and forensic engineers rely on surviving documents, comparative analysis of other Nazi underground sites, and standard 1940s industrial practices. Rather than housing exotic, physics-defying superweapons like the mythical Nazi bell, empirical evidence points to a massive, desperate initiative aimed entirely at survival and decentralization. A deep dive into the two core pillars of this mainstream consensus reveals the actual operational purpose of these subterranean complexes. By late 1943, the strategic reality of the Third Reich was collapsing under relentless Allied strategic bombing. Urban command centers in Berlin were increasingly vulnerable to total incineration. Government ministries, military intelligence, and communications networks were operating out of surface level or hastily fortified urban buildings that could no longer withstand heavy blockbusters or multi-ton Grand Slam bombs deployed by the Royal Air Force. The primary driving force behind tunneling deep into the hard gneiss of the Owl Mountains was to construct an ultra-secure, bomb-proof redoubt. This complex was meant to shelter Adolf Hitler, OKW, High Command of the Armed Forces, Core Intelligence Staffs, and centralized telecommunications hubs, so they could pretend everything was fine. This blueprint mirrored other high-level command relocations attempted by the regime, such as the Führer Bunker in Berlin, the Adler Horst Complex in Hesse, or Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Project Riese was essentially designed to be the ultimate Eastern fallback position if Berlin and Western Germany were completely overrun or flattened. Beyond housing the elite leadership, a secondary and equally critical objective was the underground relocation of vital war manufacturing and technological supply chains. Mainstream investigators frequently cross-reference Project Riese with similar massive underground construction projects in Thuringia, such as the Janastal complex. At Janastal, tunnels were carved out specifically to decentralize manufacturing for V-2 rockets, jet engines, and electrical components away from targeted surface factories. Fringe theorists often point to the massive concrete pillars and heavy-duty steel anchor points found at sites like the Wenceslas mine as proof of exotic anti-gravity testing platforms. However, structural engineers and industrial historians offer a completely mundane, practical explanation. These fixtures were standard industrial foundations. Deep underground installations required immense logistical support systems. The heavy concrete pads and anchor brackets were designed to bolt down massive, vibrating industrial machinery, such as high-capacity diesel generators for emergency power, heavy water pumps to clear constant mountain seepage, massive ventilation fans to circulate air through miles of unventilated stone tunnels, and rolling assembly lines for standard Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe munitions. It was basically a heavily fortified, cave-dwelling basement utility room. When evaluated through the lens of wartime engineering, Project Riese represents a monumental, tragic exercise in industrial survivalism. It was a desperate attempt by a collapsing totalitarian state to shove its command structure and assembly lines underground. While it failed to save the regime, its vast, empty corridors left behind a blank canvas, one that subsequent generations would inevitably fill with dark legends of lost wonder weapons. While mainstream historians look at the empirical data and see a desperate civil defense failure, the psychological conditions surrounding Project Riese made it the ultimate incubator for conspiracy and lore. The project operated under the strictest possible tier of Nazi security. Heavily guarded by the SS, isolated in dense mountain terrain, and built using enslaved populations who were routinely worked to death or evacuated, the outside world and post-war intelligence agencies had virtually zero visibility into what was actually happening inside the tunnels. In early 1945, as Soviet troops rapidly approached Lower Silesia, the evacuation order came with terrifying suddenness. Equipment was hastily smashed, entrances were blasted shut or left gaping, and files were burned in massive bonfires. It was precisely this volatile recipe, absolute wartime secrecy, unfulfilled technological ambition, unfinished labyrinthine tunnels left half submerged in mountain water, and a missing paper trail, that allowed modern folklore to flourish. In the decades following the war, the dark shadows of the Owl Mountains became a blank canvas, enabling imaginative researchers to project their wildest post. Cold War fears and technological fantasies onto the raw stone walls, giving birth to legends like the Nazi Bell. Ultimately, Project Riese sits at a fascinating historical crossroads. On one side, it stands as a grim, undeniable monument to totalitarian brutality and slave labor exploitation during the twilight of World War II. On the other, it serves as the ultimate petri dish for modern high strangeness, proving that when human history leaves behind massive, unexplained ruins wrapped in total secrecy, our collective imagination will always rush in to fill the dark. To be continued. Watch and listen. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full podcast now. Explore the archive Cosmic Awakening Volume 1, 1991, Peru, Journey into the Unknown. Sacred Valley of the Incas. Volume 2, Ascension 2012, The Golden Alchemy. Part 3, The First Contact and the Paranormal State. Join the journey. New episodes drop periodically. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute exploration into the evolution of ufology, perfect for your daily plunge into decoding hidden messages from outer space, designed to raise awareness and foster human evolution. Subscribe to support your inner development. Thumbs up to help push our channel through the algorithm. Comment below. Share your thoughts on today's episode.